Okay, it is Wednesday, December 8th, and I have a couple of announcements in regard to some of the dates of things that are still remaining for this term. First of all, we just finished last class, the in-class number 3. There's one final in-class number 4. It was originally slated for this Friday, but we are moving it to the 15th. So, and let me get that thing going so I can draw on the screen. So, let you know the remaining due dates for items. December 15th is going to be the date for in-class number 4. And that in-class is going to be focused on the front end of the application. So the stuff that's been happening in the Razor Pages portion. And the project, the group project, you will have until the end of the day on the 17th. So let me get my lines coming out nicely here. So this is when your group project is due. And so that's going to be basically due by 5 p.m. And I will assist people as much as I can through the chat. But one of the things that that kind of came up out of some questions from the chat had to do with making the connection between some of the more complex forms and the basic principles of model binding and all of that I had shared with you before. And so I want to give you a bit of a demo to show you a little bit more of the kind of one of the ways you could deal with some of the complexity of the forms with differences in your query and your command models with regard to tables and showing lists of information and gathering lists of data from the user. So I'm going to go and cover all of that. But I wanted to let everybody know about these changes in the due dates, so that you can be better prepared, and so that you know you've got some time, because I know it's extremely busy for you guys as well. So let me just grab that screenshot. And throw that into the chat. Yes, I will go through the answers for the third in class and the last take home. What I will probably do as far as that, in fact, I'm going to say I definitely will do, is I'll set up a video for that. Okay, I'll set up an out of class video, and I'll post that up so that people can watch that, and then then I really want to give our remaining class times, which will be the 17th, the 20th, and the sorry, not the 17th, the 10th, the 13th, and the 5th. Well, the 10th and the 13th, because 15th we've got in class. But I want to give our remaining class times for Q&A, for you guys to ask questions as a group, and simply because when we come together as a group, as a class, and one person has a question, oftentimes it's discovered that, hey, that question is useful for everybody else. Okay, so rather than using class time to go over the answers for the third in class and the last take home, I will be doing that via a video. Oh, and the other thing that I should also say, as far as the last take home and all that, as far as I'm concerned, you guys can keep working on that right up to this Friday if you want to add some final tweaks, or you discover something out of today's class and you want to make some final edits on your last take home. You've got until the end of Friday as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so I'll just put that in the chat as well. Last take home due at the end of Friday, December 10th. So I know a number of you guys have probably finished that and have said, okay, I've done as much as I can. You want to leave it? That's fine. That's totally fine. I'm still marking it with a good level of grace. But if you learn a couple things out of today's class and you're saying, okay, that's the part that will solve my problem that I had, then, and you want to make changes, you've got up until the end of the day on Friday, December 10th to do that. Okay. Okay, so let me sort of lay out the thing that I've been hearing people wrestling a bit with. So I've gone through before aspects about model binding, aspects about the distinction between post and get, and when to use post redirect get. And I've pointed out how when you are using post, you can be using just the regular response from a post to do whatever preserving of the data in the form until your final submission of the information to the business logic layer for being processed and sending everything into the database. But one of the questions that has come up out of that is mixing together the query information and information you're gathering for a command inside of repeated information. That is, you've got lists of information. So on the one hand, what we have is we have a list of information, and in this case, I've got a list of applicants or job candidates, as potential job candidates for a job. So I've got a list of applicants, and that basically represents my query model for the data, and it includes the name and the ID property, where the ID is a hidden type, and the name is displayed as first and last name, and you can see I'm doing bolding of the last name. But we're wanting to also turn around and gather some information regarding the command portion, and so I have got the interview date and some notes. So basically, we've received all these applications for a particular job. I've got the interview date and the notes, and I'm also going to have information that I'm gathering about the job, and all of this is going to be information I'll ultimately want to send send to the business logic layer. But how do I gather? How do I gather what is effectively a list of my command model, in this case, a candidate, in the same HTML table that I'm going and displaying all of the other information, because these are separated out as two different lists. So part of the answer to this question is to think in terms of what you may have learned as parallel arrays in programming fundamentals. Now, I am kind of doing a little bit of an assumption that they did teach you about parallel arrays in programming fundamentals. I know we used to teach it, but I know that there have been changes to that course in the intervening years since I have taught it, which has been quite a while ago. So I don't know if they've removed that or not. But hey, yeah. So 2D arrays, they may have given you two-dimensional arrays. Okay, that's good. But I don't know if they gave you parallel arrays. Did they give you parallel? Okay, some of you. Okay, yeah, good. I'm glad to see that they're still teaching that. Otherwise, I would have to. Well, I'd be throwing that into my 20 credit course, right? So, anyways, yeah. Anyways, I'll leave it at that. So this demo that I've got here, I'm going to show you one of the ways, because there's more than one way. I'm going to show you one of the ways that you can get this mixture of presenting a list of data and gathering a list of data out of the same HTML table. So that's where we're going with this. And just to give everybody a sense of confidence that this information does indeed get preserved from a post. And I don't really have anything happening in the short list except in terms of the post, except for making sure that the information for this drop down is preserved, because they can select a particular kind of a job, but they can identify people that they're maybe going to shortlist and give some dates as to when they're going to try to do the interviews. So maybe because they've looked over the resumes on all these different things, they're going to check out these people. They're going to maybe get them for a junior developer. Maybe they'll throw in some notes, ask about their capstone project that they may have done as part of their studies, or maybe for this person, we want to ask about deployment experience. because not only do you need to be able to create an application, but you need to be able to deploy it, post it up onto a website, which actually, by the way, is a question I plan on answering in January, because I will be doing a I am planning on doing a live presentation to help people on some of the skills that they need for going into Capstone to try to get the most out of it. One of those would be about how do we deploy our web applications, and so I'll talk a bit about that in January. Pay attention to the Nate Coders channel in the Discord, and maybe somebody can just throw another little link in the chat for the Nate Coders Discord group, so that if you haven't already become part of that, you can learn about that. So and maybe there'll be some other notes, such as Zach Harwood is the son of the CEO. So maybe that's going to be an important piece of information as they do their job interviews. But when I click on shortlist, you'll see that it goes through this posting process and all the information has been preserved. So I've got the effect of two-way binding in preserving all of that information. And of course, the question now is, how did I do that? So let's take a little look at the source code for all of this. First of all, I just want to set up the situation as far as the data that I've got. So I created I've been doing some reorganizing of some of my code samples in my solution sandbox. Part of that includes a service called Random Data Service, where I list job applicants. So I'm just dumping out a hard-coded list of information. I don't have a database in the back end, but pretend that I do. And in the same way, I'm going to have a list of job openings out of my service. So again, pretending that that's coming from the database. I have a method for scheduling interviews, but I don't have any code in there because, again, the whole focus of this is not so much the back end, it's the front end. How do we work with the front end? Well, on the front end side of things, I'm going to have my dependency injection for my random data service as part of constructor injection. And I'm going to have a drop down of the list of job openings. So this is for the drop down. And then the selected opening is going to be for the selected item in the drop down. Okay, so I'm doing a bind property on that. And then the rest of my information are these applicants and candidates. And so in this approach, I'm starting out candidates as an empty array of the list of candidate. And in the on get, I'm getting my job applicants and listing my job openings. In the on post, I'm just simply listing my job openings because this info for the drop down is drop downs. I'm going to assume will remain unchanged. Now that maybe that wouldn't be a good thing. Maybe I should be having my list of openings also handled as a bound property to preserve it all. But I want to focus in on the stuff that's going to be displayed in the HTML table. So the following two list of T will be both displayed and gathered in an HTML table. That's the setup of the data. I've got my applicants and I've got my candidates. Candidates is set up as an empty array just to help me with my processing. So what did I do in the CS HTML? Well, here in my list, and I'll just go full screen because that'll make it a little bit easier to be able to see everything that's happening in the body of my loop. What I've got going on is my loop where I'm looping through the applicants. So that again was my query model. And what I'm doing is inside of this loop, I decided to find the associated candidate information for that. And so as I'm basically going through and treating this almost like parallel arrays, where I'm matching them not based upon an index position, as you would do in a parallel array, but upon the ID of the applicant versus the ID of the candidate I'm going to use as a shortlist candidate. I'm making that association that way. So I'm preparing all of my, or preparing each one of my command model data to just get the information for this form. And I have a couple of considerations that I want to do. So the considerations that I want to keep in mind is I want this to work on the first display of the page. So when they are first doing their original GET request, so that's the GET request, as well as on subsequent displays, that is post requests, before everything is sent to the business logic layer. So there may be some other stuff that's going on. So how do I preserve it? Well, again, I had started out with an empty list of the model dot candidates, and when I look for the matching ID with an empty list, of course, it's going to come back with the default, which is a null candidate. And here I'm just grabbing the interview date and the notes. The information for the candidate is basically the ID of the candidate, whether the candidate is being shortlisted, and what date I'm setting and what notes I'm going and applying. So I'm preserving a lot of that information through some hidden fields. So notice once again, I am setting up an index that I can use to bind to the candidate's property. So remember, as I'm doing all of these things with name value pairs, I am trying to get the model binding based all on the name to go against the candidate's property and the applicant's property of my page model. So I am, and let me just undo that. I am actually gathering all the stuff for the candidates out of the two hiddens and this checkbox, as well as this input and this text area. So I'm throwing in a little extra things here to sort of help you with some stuff. In regard to the interview date, which I'm putting in this input type equal date, I have a little processing here because I wanted to basically simplify that whole aspect of getting the date in the proper format for for an input type equal date. So so I did a little bit of formatting of all of that kind of information, both for the date as well as for even the notes. Because again, the candidate could be null the first time through, but once they hit the post, remember all this model binding is going to take place to put in the candidates of the particular ID for all of their pieces of information. The ID, the short list, which is a Boolean, the interview date, and the notes. And once again, because I'm treating these kind of like parallel arrays, not based on an index, but based upon the ID of the person, I'm using that person ID that was part of my query model as the way that I'm identifying it. So I can trust that I have, as I loop through all of the query model data, I can trust that for each person I've got an ID. And because I can trust that I've got that ID, I can go ahead and use that in some of the key stuff to set up the model binding for my command model information. As I preserve all the candidates' information. And then what I do, of course, is I'm turning around and I'm doing the values being preserved, the interview date, the notes. By the way, you should probably observe that for a text area, so for text area, two-way binding, the value goes between the open and close tags rather than a value attribute on the HTML element. So text area's got its own little uniqueness to it. Okay, and also noting that for Boolean sorts of stuff, in regard to checkboxes, or at least two single checkboxes. I'm going to make that note, and that is if you have a single checkbox that binds to a Boolean, you want to use checked, use these attributes. You want to use the checked as the thing that you use for the two-way feedback on that, but you want to use the value to be set as true, because that's pretty critical right there. Because it's a Boolean, you want that value to be true. So in this small example, I'm kind of packing together a lot of edge case pieces of information in regard to the HTML tags, as well as this whole notion of mixing the query model and the command model. And let me also go and do a blue box here, because I want you to see that with my model.applicants, the query model data, I have that as a bind property as well. And I'm preserving that for posts. So I'm preserving the query model data through the hidden fields. that I have right here. I'm displaying the person's first name and last name, but I want to remember the first name and last name when the form is submitted. So I got to have them as input type equal hidden, and remember the ID as well, so that when the user clicks a button to do a post, I'm going to preserve both the query model data as well as the command model data. And that will help me if I happen to have other controls on the form where maybe the user is going to be doing some other information or that. This is how I'm preserving those together. Give me some questions if you have any in the chat, and I will address those kinds of things. And in the meantime, while you're thinking of some questions, I'm going to grab a screenshot. Now, I mentioned before that this is one way of doing it. I do want to also give you some discussions on some alternative ways of approaching it. And maybe I'll even start off with a question. Thumbs up if you have found this helpful. And like I said, feel free to ask questions. I realize, you may not be sure exactly what questions. You're kind of digesting all of this information. Yes, I will be uploading this example to my workbook on GitHub. And yes, exactly. That's part of the beauty of having these lessons recorded, is that your first exposure to the information, you're grasping the information and holding on to it with tentative hands as you're trying to get a firm grip. It helps to rewatch the video and to get that information. I totally get it. I do that myself when I'm learning stuff. Doesn't matter how long you've been learning things, and that you benefit from that. Now there are some other alternative approaches that I could have used for some of this. Notice how I'm doing the candidate is the model.candidate single or default, because I needed to accommodate the aspect that the very first time through, that list of candidates is going to be an empty list. But I could have gone and done a slightly different approach. So as an alternative, after I get the applicants, one of the things that I could do is I could have looped through all the applicants and created empty instances of candidate objects for my list of candidates property. So this thing right here, the list of candidates property, which I had basically set up as an empty list, I could have put actual candidate objects inside of them. And the only piece of information I would have been able to fill it with would have been really the ID. So at this point, the only real or the only piece I before E except after C. The only piece of data to capture is the ID of the applicant candidate. As I go and I create these instances, whether they're actually selected to be shortlisted, whether or what the interview date is going to be, whatever notes, that's going to come from the user on the form. So if I would have set it up a little bit differently in the on get, that might have simplified a bit of the code that I had in the back end. And so that would be a slight variation on this approach. And there are other ways I could wind up dealing with this as well. I could have created maybe a overall list of a single list of items that combined applicants and candidate information at the front end. But generally speaking, I do like the idea of keeping my command and my query models separate and distinct, but I could have brought in something called a tuple. And I know this is really getting into some more advanced aspects of C# when you're working with tuples. That's probably something you have about. In fact, let me go ahead and ask that question. Happy face if you are one of the few students who have seen or used a tuple data type before. Again, that's not one of the things that we get into teaching, except in my 20 credit class. So there's a lot of different ways you could do it, but the essence is it probably is the same kind of a thing as what you'll see in Python. So when I talk about a tuple, tuples aren't unique to C#. They're in all sorts of other programming languages as well. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if it's in Python as well. So, in fact, if you're doing Python, if you wind up doing Dart for Android mobile, if you wind up doing Flutter/Dart for Android mobile, or you wind up doing some stuff in Java or various other kinds of programming languages, you'll see these notions of generics, tuples, and many other kinds of things. They're just common in a lot of different other languages. So yeah. So I hope that this is a useful kind of an example for you. I am going to post it up onto the site. Now I'm going to make a couple other little notes. In fact, I'll go and I'll get it posted up right away. But one of the things is about the user secrets that I'm working with in this. So the the latest user secrets for my example, include some key application settings for the default super user who is acting as a webmaster for the website. Because it's the super user, I threw in a little bit of stuff for security. It's the super user who's going to have access to all of the spy agency stuff. And I moved some of the spy agency BLL stuff into its own separate BLL class, secret service, and I've been starting to build up some extra information, extra pages on the spy agency under a secured folder. One of the other things that I've done in regard to that secured is I have thrown in on the layout a little bit of stuff. I actually have it kind of commented out right now, but I will uncomment this. KU and U, I'll uncomment that part. So this here will hide these super secret pages from everyone but the super user that's going to log on to this. And I can also do, and I don't think I actually did that in the startup yet, but in the startup CS where I add the Razor pages, I believe I can put in the options such that I do the following things, and I say for my options, if I spell options correctly, if I say for my options, authenticate, actually, what was it on the sample stuff that I gave in the project as well? Remind me later. Starter kit project. Under my addendum, where I go and I talk about the requiring authentication. Options conventions authorized folder. That's what it is. Options.conventions, where I want to authorize a folder, and specifically what I want to use is secured. I want to basically state that only signed in users can access the secured folders pages. And I haven't gotten anything into identifying or applying security authorization based upon roles or policies or all that other sort of stuff. Another thing to look forward to in January, because there's so many other things I want to be able to teach you for Capstone, which will be very useful. But I won't be able to teach them fully, but certainly in the presentations, I'm going to be able to give you some good starting information and where you can go and get more information so that you can have a real awesome capstone project that you do for your clients. So let me go and do this. Control F5. And let me go into the README. So the super user's username is going to be that. I'll go back to my web app. So you'll notice that the way it is that spies or us thing is missing. But if I go to the login and put in that email with my default user password, now I can see the spies or us, and I'll be able to see about doing the global assignments and agent skills. And I think I even have a default page that I'm starting up there. Spies or us, eh? Or USA. See, we're not part of the United States of America. We're actually the USA, the Canadian nation. Oh, I do too much of this stuff late at night when I get, you know, uh, punch drunk sleepy. So there you go. There's a demo for you. Let me go and push this up onto GitHub. Final major sandbox demo. One other little thing that I want to sort of point out to everyone as a bit of an idea. When you're working on your capstone project, you may find yourself wrestling with some of the concepts. How am I actually going to be able to, do this in my particular situation? I recommend that you have, besides having your capstone project itself, that you have a separate Visual Studio solution outside of your repository for your team repository. Have this separate Visual Studio solution as a sandbox for your project concepts, so that just like I've been using this as a grab bag to demonstrate a lot of different items. So to refresh your memory, under the demos, I've got my color palette picker, my one-way, two-way model binding, my job candidates. All of these are extra simplified examples to focus in on a particular idea or concept, to practice that particular thing. If you keep that sandbox stuff separate from your actual project, you can refine your learning and understanding in the sandbox stuff, and then actually go and apply the concept into your project afterwards. If you keep those separate, that'll help keep your project clean. Because remember, for your group project, you're going to want to be committing code that compiles as the very minimum. Even if you've got logic errors, it's got to be able to compile. But you may be running into some problems you don't know how to deal with. Well, do those in a separate Visual Studio solution, where you don't have to worry about it compiling or not compiling. It's your grab bag thing. If it gets too full or too complicated, make another sandbox to play in. There's no limit to all these separate little things you can use as part of your learning stuff, but keep it separate from what you're actually doing for your lab. That'll help you a lot as you're moving stuff across. Make notes for yourself. You can even make notes in your project code, to go and say things like, maybe you're going to want to say things like, see the XYZ page in my sandbox UI project, or something like that, as a note to self, right? note to self, right? You can do all that sort of stuff. So those are just some tips and techniques. So that's the end of my recording for today. But if you want to just use the rest of the time for lab work, you're free to use that. But I'm going to come back after a 10-minute break here to answer any questions people may have. I'll include that in today's recording as well. But we'll see you guys in about 10 minutes and see if anybody has any questions. So one of the questions coming up is just for some clarity around our use of input hidden on pages and forms, and this talk about preserving information not in the database but in the web page. And so to get a clearer understanding of that, I just want to draw some pictures and make some comments. And this is a black screen because I want to draw on it. So let me go and do a little bit of a box. And here's a keyboard. This here is basically our situation of having the browser. And over on the other side of the internet is another computer that is a web server. You can tell it's a web server because it's a box with a picture of the globe on it with appropriate continents drawn on the side by our artistic friends in the back end. So here's what happens. We've got our request that goes over the internet to the web server. And then, of course, we've also got our response that goes from the web server back to the browser. And so I'll just make a little note here. We've got our web server. If you ever get using some network programs to draw network diagrams and that sort of stuff, they'll often represent a web server as a vertical rectangle with a globe in the upper right. If it's a database server, they'll have the same rectangle but with a cylinder to represent a database on the top right. And then there's other kinds of servers you can wind up having as in terms of network, more complicated networks. So we're drawing the simple picture where we've got our request and we've got our response. The important thing to remember is that this is a completely disconnected system. In other words, and let me try to draw that as a straight line. So when we say that HTTP is stateless, what we're saying is that with HTTP, the web server is not keeping an active memory of the information that is in the browser. In fact, the only way that the web server ever gets any information is if the browser sends a request. And then the web server can process that, send out its response. But at the point that the response goes back to the browser, the web server cleans up its memory. So it's created an instance of our pages. So preserving the information in the browser can involve the use of input type equal hidden, as well as other things like cookies or browser storage. Many people don't realize, but modern browsers nowadays have built-in databases. And there's this thing called browser storage. Effectively, it for browsers like Chromium and that, this is a SQLite database that's embedded inside of the browser, and it can use storage to put information that way inside of there. So the use of things like the input type hidden, as well as other things like cookies and browser storage and all that sort of stuff, allow information to be available in a page or form that will be posted to the web server in any subsequent request. And other techniques can be used as well. Besides full page requests, you have this notion of AJAX and these WebSockets providing an access to the web server. It still goes through the request response cycle, but it's not a full page request. It winds up becoming like a background request that happens on the page from the browser's perspective. So this is why we need to use things like the hidden input type. And of course, you've got all the other input types where they actually draw stuff on the screen in the browser. But that's how we keep the information that came from the original response in the browser, as well as do our edits to the input controls that we have for sending our request back to the web server for further processing. And then what happens on the web server's side of things is that the web server can effectively recreate the state of the browser through the form fields that were submitted in the request to the web server from the browser. And so in ASP.NET Core, hooking up this data to our page models is done under the hood for us by the built-in model binding mechanism that that they've built for all of that. And I think there's another comment I wanted to make, and I'm trying to remember what it was I was thinking as I was typing that out. Got the stuff being sent. This is certainly all the major stuff. There's a lot of different things to sort of learn as well, kind of behind the scenes, but that's the whole thing to keep in mind, is that the HTTP protocol is stateless by nature. That's a key thing out of all of this understanding. Okay. That was an excellent question, by the way. You know, there are so many things that, particularly when we teach these things a number of times, that we as instructors have in our mind as being obvious, or we sometimes think this information has been supplied to you guys maybe through some of your other courses and all of that. But I kind of like to be at times the Captain Obvious amongst instructors, because the obvious isn't necessarily obvious to us, isn't necessarily the well known to everybody else, and so I like to do that. Any other kind of questions before I sign off for today? Let me give a little thumbs up to your having asked that question, because it was a good one. Oh, this was the other point. Now I remember the other point in regard to this whole picture. So I'll put this in the recording. I won't put it in here. But when we talk about two-way binding and one-way binding, what we're basically talking about here is that this going from the browser to the web server is the first of the of two-way or one-way binding, taking the information from the browser and model binding it into our actual information for here. And then what winds up happening is in the response that goes out, this is effectively the second way of two-way binding that goes on. So that's a helpful thing to be able to see. And yes, that actually does even deserve a screenshot. So I will make a screenshot just so you get an updated image. Screenshot of a screenshot. Very meta here. Let me do a trim, copy all, paste. Okay, so I hope that you found this helpful and useful. With that in mind, I think I will sign off for today, and I will catch you on Friday's class. Bye for now.